Stephen.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, yeah, so we can continue.
Pause the recording, Daniela. We should pause it. Yeah, okay.
Okay, we can head out. So it's my great pleasure to convene the fourth panel in this fantastic conference devoted to icons and relics, which will bring together very beautifully the interests of all four panelists in material aspects of the Christian and Muslim experience in the Near East. We will hear all four speakers consecutively, and then hopefully we'll have 30 minutes or so for discussion. So please, if you have questions, you can write them down in the chat function, or preferably wait for the Q&A session and then raise your hand and I will call on you. So I will promptly proceed by introducing the first speaker. Anne E. Lester is the John W. Baldwin and Yeni Yokens Associate Chair in Medieval History at Johns Hopkins University. She is the author of Creating Cistercian Nuns, the Women's Religious Movement and its Reform in 13th Century Champagne, published by Cornell in 2011, and has co-edited several collections of essays, of which probably the most relevant for our gathering this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are, is Crusades and Memory, Rethinking Past and Present, published in 2015, which incidentally features essays by two other panelists today, Nicholas Paul and William Perkis. Dr. Lester currently holds the NEH Fellowship for completing two projects. One is her second monograph entitled Fragments of Devotion, Relics, Remembrance, and Material Histories in the Aftermath of the Fourth Crusade. And the second one is a project on Oud of Nevers and the material Outremer. She's also editing a special issue for the Medieval History Journal on the topic of materiality in the medieval and early modern worlds within things, ways of knowing and narrating, to be published in 2022. And this volume will no doubt complement the issue she co-edited on medieval materiality for the journal English Language Note in 2015. And the title of her lecture today will be Framing the Cross, Liturgy, Prayer, and Object in Personal and Public Ritual After 1187. Dr. Lester, the microphone is yours.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so we can get going. Let's see, there we go. I hope that's good and you can all hear me okay. Good, excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for Daniela and others for inviting me to take part. Yanni, I'm thrilled to be here and to learn all that I've learned so far and in the days to come. So today, I share a series of challenges, and really I would love questions, help, and advice. Challenges that I've been grappling with in my current book project, exploring the reception and meaning of relics from Constantinople and the Levant in the decades after the Fourth Crusade. More precisely, I take as my focus a series of still extant objects, which I would argue require still more thought. These are small true cross reliquaries. They are. Also known as Stavrotiki, which entered the West in the second half of the 12th century, and then in even greater numbers after the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Although, as I shall show, we can speak generally about the reception and donation of relics of the True Cross in some public or cathedral contexts, much less is known about how these smaller relics and reliquaries were used and understood in Northern Europe when crusaders or their clerics or chaplains carried them into the West as they returned home. My remarks represent some initial attempts at approaching this question, and more specifically, some comments about how to reconstruct the ritual use and meaning of objects in the absence of textual accounts, from the reading of an object's framing alone. Although my evidence is not rooted in the medieval Middle East, it is part of a long tradition of portable objects used to represent or stand in for the Holy Land when its territory was lost or closed to permanent Christian habitation and control. In this sense, I'm also interested in the movement of objects between and among Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures, or in my case, most explicitly between Byzantine and Latin Christians in the East and West. So in an essay published in 2004, Anthony Cutler remarked that, quote, an object all but disappears when it is assigned to a society to which it does not belong. As a result, it may be written out of both scholarly consideration and the broader treatment of a culture undertaken by authors who depend to a greater or lesser extent on the work of specialists. In a volume dedicated to France and the Holy Land, Cutler called attention then to the exclusion of Muslims in both contemporary Frankish writing and modern scholarly consideration. He went on to note that, quote, conversely, something is lost when a complex object is treated unquestioningly as the product of a single society, a monolith within a monoculture, mindless of the many strands that make up its fabric and the multitude of responses that this very diversity would have evoked. The Stavrotiki that I would like to consider today inhabit some of this lost space, both in the context that they were translated into and in the modern scholarly treatment. Small, made to be held in the hand and thus carried in personal and sometimes private ways, such Stavrotiki were portable objects of both personal and at times public devotion. Their movement was so ubiquitous as to be obscured by the translations of other more prominent objects, used to recenter or redefine the locales that welcomed them in the West. But their object histories, or histories as objects, offer a more complex story. So in the years after 1204 and the fall of the city of Constantinople to French, Flemish, and Venetian crusaders that concluded the Fourth Crusade, we know that hundreds of relics and devotional objects were carried into Northern Europe, some as loot, most as gifts and personal mementos, and still others as furta sacra. Although many relics and devotional objects made their way into Crusader Europe in the decades before 1204, the Fourth Crusade saw the sheer number of objects increase exponentially. Yet we know a great deal more about some prominent relics among this number. For example, the face of John the Baptist received at Amiens, or the head of Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, given to Chartres. That relic no longer exists, so I cannot show you. Or the relics of the more obscure Saint Mamas venerated in the Cathedral of Langres. In each of these cases, formal public Adventist or reception ceremonies were planned and staged, and we have written sources describing the events put on to welcome the relics into their new communities in the West. Distinctive offices were composed for each of these relics that knit together the new devotional community, in this case in France, with the relics from the East. These offices were sung, often accompanied by urban processions, on an annual basis. In many instances, as in Paris and Soissons, Amiens, separate supplementary offices or feast days were created to celebrate the advent of a group of as a group. Susceptio or reception ceremonies then reenacted the Adventist or triumphant celebrations. It was most likely in these more generalized, inclusive ceremonies that relics of the cross, and especially smaller phylacteries listed in cathedral and church inventories, would have been displayed and venerated in what we might call more public-oriented celebrations. In other cases, we know after 1204, if not earlier during the Crusade period, cross relics were venerated during annual feasts for the cross, namely those in celebration of the invention or finding of the true cross, which fell on May 4th and honored Helen and Constantine in the liturgy, and the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross on the 14th of September, honoring Heraclius's recovery of the true cross in 629. Both were established feasts within the Western liturgical cycle, and thus, as cross relics appeared in the West, they were integrated into ceremonies that were already in place. And we know, in addition, that in many settings, cross reliquaries were venerated during Good Friday. As I have argued elsewhere, such scripted receptions meant that Eastern relics were appropriated with relative ease, assimilating Byzantine or Levantine objects into Western liturgical calendars with its attendant rituals. In all of these instances, the Byzantine or Middle East context from which the relics or devotional objects hailed served both to authenticate their provenance and quite deliberately to elide or collapse the distance between Jerusalem, Constantinople, and the new Jerusalems within France and Northern Europe. But what of the smaller objects that were less well known and that had far less elaborate textual sources attached to them? The phylacteries and encolpia, the small Stavrotiki that either found their way into larger church treasuries, only then to fade into collections kept in larger boxes, or rebuilt Gothic reliquaries to hold and contain them, as was the case most famously perhaps at Stavelot, but also, just to name a few examples, at Metlac, Corbie, Cologne, and Clairvaux. Or that perhaps as singular, personal, and thus private devotional objects kept in the architectural spaces of aristocratic chapels or within collections of portable devotional objects as part of personal chapels. What of these objects? Sometimes, as we know from charters and successive inventories, they moved back and forth on multiple journeys on crusade to the Holy Land or to Constantinople, Cyprus, North Africa, and Egypt. In a very few cases, we can identify objects that moved with other portable things, such as rings, pins, psalters, breviaries, and romance books, books in French, in other words, that moved among generations of crusaders or from a crusading lord to his female kin, where they were then kept from circulating further and given a different object life in the West. So my questions regarding these smaller crosses are twofold. What did these objects mean to those who came to possess them, particularly in the West? And how were they used and understood in their new contexts? Behind these questions lie an additional question of transmission. How might knowledge of either meaning or use in the context of Constantinople or the Levant have passed into Europe, overcoming barriers of language, custom, ritual, and gender? How might we know, if it did, if practices, ideas, rituals were known and shared? In the absence of texts, can we work from these objects to draw some answers? Of course, in iconography, inscription, and form, they would have appeared as objects from the East, and thus had value in this sense. And I'll just say, for those who may not know, the Stavelot triptych right here in the center are the Byzantine, true cross reliquaries, these small Stavrotiki that are reframed, for example, in the larger late 12th century Mohassen altarpiece. So in iconography, inscription, and form, they would have appeared as objects from the East and thus had some value in this sense. But here I want to move us beyond a conclusion about Western desires for Eastern things. What else was evident in their form as objects that offers clues about ritual and meaning? So given the time, I will focus on one example from which we might make some more generalized conclusions. Carried into France sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, the so-called Aqua Cross holds and conveys aspects of the French encounter with the Byzantine world in the first decades of the 13th century, most likely in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade. In its current state, and even when it was first created, it is and was an assembled object, a composite of materials, techniques, images, and words, that is, inscriptions, that together convey many overlapping meanings. Visible today in the Louvre, the cross is composed of two distinct parts, and I'm going to just kind of move us through the slides as if we were walking around this object in the Louvre. One, at its center, is the Byzantine goldwork Stavrotiki that you can see here. It is a piece of goldwork with a sliding lid, dated by Yannick Durand, among others, to the late 12th century. But the other is a later silver and copper gilt base, which sits atop 6 small lions with 2 Gothic angels on bended knee, holding the Byzantine reliquary. Sorry, and this newer work, you can see the base here, dates from about 1320 to 1340. The lid or exterior of the Aqua Cross depicts the archangels Michael and Gabriel, with Mary and John the Theologian at the foot of the cross, which itself is a relic. When the box is opened, one encounters, again, Michael and Gabriel at the very top here, But this time, in a parallel act of inventio or finding, the viewer sees Helen and Constantine, who flank a second cross relic. Both the outer lid and interior of the Byzantine Stavrotiki bear inscriptions in Greek, identifying the angels, as well as Mary and John, Helen and Constantine. Then, running along the bottom of the 14th century base is an inscription pressed into the gilt-work, which states in French, "Cet sanctuaire où il y a de la vraie grâce, fit ainsi en estufère Madame, noble dame, Madame Marguerite d'Arc, Dame de Yacour. Prière Notre Seigneur pour lui qui lui donne bonne vie et bonne fin. Amen." The noble lady Marguerite d'Arc, Lady of Yacour, thus enshrines this sanctuary, where there is a piece of the true cross. Pray to our Lord for her, that he should give her a good life and a good end. Amen. The Yacour patronage of the outer 14th century base then gives this Byzantine object its French appellation and framing. As an ensemble, the crosses, one opening to reveal another, are both devotional and triumphant, and in the 14th century, they are given the additional weight of commemoration. In the most straightforward sense, then this is a reframed Byzantine object, at once relic and reliquary. Yet its form, materials, and inscription function together, in complex and reinforcing ways, not evident or described in a text or liturgy, for which none survive in any case. A series of things were at work in the framing that echoes what we know of Byzantine use and meaning in the Middle East and in Greece. And the viewer is presented with interlocking revelations built on the process of opening, on the cross as material that held multiple meanings, and on the intimacies of scale. So in the Crusade context, the cross in the Yacour example, displayed multiple layers of meaning. If closed, the first encounter would be with the cross of the crucifixion. So if it were closed, we would see only the bottom portion, of course. Symbolizing Christ's sacrifice, which finds an intended echo in the sacrifice of the Crusader. But when opened, the viewer is pulled into a doubled act of inventio, for the opening of the lid performs an act commemorative of finding the true cross by Helen and Constantine, and an act of devotion on the part of the viewer, who is recursively drawn into the discovery of the cross at its center. There are thus two crosses distinguished by their iconography, the first with a single bar, the second with two bars associated with the cross triumphant. That is both the cross discovered by Helen and Constantine, but that is reclaimed by Heraclius, who triumphantly returned it to Jerusalem. If viewed in the decades after 1187, after Jerusalem fell to Saladin's armies and returned to Muslim rule, the triumphant message of the cross, now held in the viewer's hands or set upon an altar, would have an even more resonant ritual significance. For some measure of triumph could be had in Europe, if not in the absent Middle East. Here then, the cross, however small and fragmentary, could be reassuringly and literally in Christian hands. These layers of meaning, moreover, were communicated in and through the object of the cross and its frames, not by a text. The fact that the Yacour cross, while unique in some respects, it is, according to Yannick Durand, one of the only example of a complete Byzantine Stavrotiki in France, still to have its box, lid, and cross in place. But it did resemble hundreds of other small cross reliquaries, and ensured a visual argument by force that, together, these different reliquaries, ensured a visual argument by force of abundance and replication. This was, as other scholars have noted, a form of mediatization, which deployed the cross and its reframing to work through its many replicated fragments as a whole. So harder to assess, let me go back to our previous image here. Harder to assess are my second set of questions, having to do with ritualized use and meaning. Here, some conclusions can be drawn not from image, iconography, or material, but from the required actions, manipulations, and scale of the object, and those like it. For the size of objects like the Yacour cross, again, quite similar in size and dimension to this other Jerusalem Stavrotiki, the size and dimension, of objects like the Yacour cross let us know that they were part of a group or class of things that moved with ease, deliberately, usually as gifts, among relatives, friends, kin, and diplomatic negotiations to forge or reify connections of a personal nature. They were, in short, designed to be circulated as social objects that created relationships between individuals. As such, small Stavrotiki, like the Encolpia or phylacteries that Ivan Dorpik has recently discussed, were meant to be carried on one's person, either in hand or sometimes on chains around the neck, or even if not carried, then interacted with bodily, in a bodily manner through kneeling and kissing, or sometimes being placed on the body after death. The Aqua Cross's later framing is therefore also an instruction guide for the 14th century Western user. The angels model how to interact with relics of the cross, to hold them reverently on bended knee. Similarly, with the attached lid, and a box of depth in 3 dimensions, the small Stavrotiki, like the Encolpia, were to be manipulated, opened and closed. Those holding the cross were asked by virtue of the object's making to engage in physical acts of revelation, to look inside, to see with depth, to find truth through triumphant discovery. As Dorpik has also noted, these were or could become ritualized actions. But given the small scale, they were also intended to be intensely personal, focusing the eyes, hands, and mind of a single first-person viewer. These were, as many scholars have shown, Byzantine and Middle Eastern techniques of ritual interactions that came into the West and were learned, here I argue, by virtue of the devotional objects themselves. And one is tempted to make an analogy to our own small handheld devices that open with passwords and are intensely personal, yet can be manipulated with great ease and speed by those, say, under 12, with no instructions at all. In short, the assembled object holds multiple interlocking histories that work together and that far exceed in complexity, temporal range, and scale what could be expressed in a narrative text. It would be much harder to write out the, or even a, history of the Aqua Cross, for example. And as Daniela noted at the start of this workshop, there could be at least 10 histories here, multiple histories in this one object. What we have is a more compact then and multi-layered devotional historical object containing multiple interlocking and interreferent histories, both sacred and mundane, past and forward-looking. And this was, I think, the intention. The Aqua Cross, of course, is one of hundreds of such objects that were carried into Northern Europe during the period of the Crusades and especially in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade. And while some display inscriptions in Greek, and can be traced, therefore, to a world of Greek-speaking Christian practice, others may have hailed from Jerusalem or the Levant and have no inscriptions or occasionally bear inscriptions in Latin. Anatole Forlot has catalogued all the known examples of fragments of the true cross, similar to the Aqua Cross, and estimated that there were well over 500 such fragments in the West by the end of the 13th century. They were used in both monastic and cathedral settings, as well as for personal devotion. And the Aqua Cross, an example that we can think of, of the latter, that is used personally, may have stayed within the Yacour family, a local Champenois knightly family that by the 1230s held the fiefs and castle that made up the small, well-connected lordship of Yacour, just outside of Bar-sur-Aube, on the border of Champagne and Burgundy, that is in the Crusade heartland of Eastern France. How explicitly were Eastern ideas and rituals known as these objects entered into Western treasuries and personal collections? It's hard to guess. Some men, especially clerics and clergy, did learn something of Byzantine ceremonial rites in the East and offer descriptions and some instructions about them. But the transfer of knowledge, particularly about more private and personal practices, rituals and prayers with and around such sacred objects, is something that can, I would argue, be at least partly assessed from the objects themselves and their frames, even if this requires a different kind of work. I've taken the Aqua Cross as an example, but there are many other like this, small reliquaries and Encolpia that functioned in similar ways, whose possession and manipulation engaged a process of revelation that was continually reenacted with and through the reliquary object, through its opening and viewing as demanded by its frame and size. These smaller objects, often not of great monetary value, suggest not just a Western desire for Eastern things, for the exotic, the different, or authentic, but they also speak of the appeal of Middle Eastern ways of accessing and engaging a religious experience. They carried a set of practices that began to transform devotion in the West, that also engaged new media, new forms of intimacy, and corporality in that process. The rituals of kneeling, kissing, and speaking a prayer for the owner echoed the rituals of devotion used in Byzantium, however aware or self-conscious of this shared experience a later French devotee may have been. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. My personal reliquary tells me that we too need to move forward ceremonially, or should I say triumphantly, to our next speaker. Stephennie Mulder is Associate Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the University of Texas, Austin, and is the president of the Middle East Medievalists Organization. She's a specialist in Islamic art, architectural history, and archaeology. She worked for over 10 years as the head ceramicist at Balis, a medieval Islamic city in Syria, and has also conducted archaeological and art historical fieldwork in Syria and Israel when that was possible, I gather, as well as in Turkey and elsewhere in the region. Dr. Mulder's book, The Shrines of the Alids in Medieval Syria, Sunnis, Shi'is, and the Architecture of Coexistence, published in the prestigious series Edinburgh Studies in Islamic Art in 2014, received numerous awards, including the Hamilton Book Award Grand Prize from the Syrian Studies Association. She has also published on matters related to heritage preservation and the trade in looted antiquities. Among her many influential essays, I will mention the one published in a volume edited in 2019 by Nicholas Paul, our next speaker, whose Middle Ages, under the timely and unfortunately ever relevant title, and I hope that I get the intonation right. No, people in the Middle East haven't been fighting since the beginning of time, right? And the title of her talk is Embodying the Light of God, Polyvalent Iconographies at 3 Medieval Syrian Shrines. Please.
Thank you, Uri, and thank you to Daniela and to Yoni and to everyone who worked so hard to organize this truly remarkable symposium. It's just I feel honored to be in the company of this tremendous lineup of speakers and to be able to speak across different disciplines and different cultural and religious spheres. And I think that this type of conversation is really important to be having, of course, in this particular moment of rising sentiments of religious nationalism around the world. So I'm grateful to be here, and thanks for that very kind introduction, Uli, and hello, Nicholas. I really loved that. And your paper was fantastic. And I can't wait to talk about it in the discussion, because there are so many overlaps between the main argument that I'm trying to make here too, which is about the multiple functions of ritual objects and the ways in which they can be encountered and read by different groups and how they transform over time. So this is also a paper, I'm going to focus specifically on iconography, a rather hoary term from art history. And I'm really going to think especially about iconographic ambiguity. So let me share my screen. I'm incapable of speaking without at least like 40 images. All right, so this paper aims to explore a question about the basic nature of iconography in Islamic art, or namely, to what degree is the function and reception of iconography universal? Or to be more specific, did medieval Islamic iconography express meaning in the way scholars have argued it did in the Western art historical tradition, of course, the origin of the whole historiographical method of iconographic reading, or were aesthetic signs understood and appreciated in some different way by medieval Muslims? These questions are still very much unresolved in my field, I would say. Just a decade ago, a volume of essays edited by Islamic art historian Robert Hildenbrand explicitly invokes the Panofskian tradition of iconographic interpretation, which was formulated, of course, for Western art, in which there is often a presumed one-to-one correspondence between image and meaning, most famously expressed in his assessment of the Arnolfini double portrait as representing a wedding contract. But my encounter with one of the most well-known iconographic symbols in Islamic art during my research in Syria made me wonder how well suited Panofsky's 60-year-old formulation is for thinking about art outside of the Western canon, and made me wonder whether it's time for a reevaluation of kind of the method of iconography in general. My object today will be to think about this larger question through the lens of something concrete and specific, namely the mihrab image, a term coined by the Islamic art historian Noha Khoury to describe a common decorative motif in Islamic art. Here, I will argue that 3 examples of the mihrab image found at the Mashhad Al-Mohassen in Aleppo and at the shrine of Khalid ibn al-Walid in Homs illuminate how this ritual object may have had ambiguous and polyvalent meanings. Furthermore, images like these, with their nuanced and subtle flexibility of meaning, helped create a new, and as I have argued, sectarian neutral landscape of Ghalid holy sites in the 11th through the 13th centuries in Syria. Collectively, sites like these were revered by both Sunnis and Shi'is and created a sacred landscape that commemorated the presence and actions of various Ghalid holy figures by using a symbol which was simultaneously universal and particular. The term mihrab image refers to a 2-dimensional representation of a lamp hung within a niche, a common aesthetic convention in Islamic art and architecture. The lamp is often framed by 2 candlesticks and depicted as if suspended from an arch. Frequently, the composition is augmented with inscriptions, most commonly a verse known as the throne verse, the light verse, for example, but also sometimes, as in this example, the light verse. The image is found in many parts of the Islamic world, from Yemen to Iran. They first appear around the 11th century, but in Syria and Egypt, they seem to become particularly prominent in the Mamluk era, in the early 14th century. In the 14th century, excuse me, and 15th century. At first glance, it seems to be a version of a mihrab, a standard feature of mosque architecture in the form of a niche in the wall, indicating the direction of prayer. However, Khoury makes a critical distinction between standard 3-dimensional niche mihrabs, meant to indicate the direction of prayer, and these types of mihrab images, primarily because the flat images are not located on the Qibla wall, the wall indicating the direction of Mecca, but are instead found in the context of tombstones, cenotaphs, and on shrine-related objects. Furthermore, the Arabic sources also distinguish between the 2 types, referring to the 2-dimensional mihrab by a special terminology, either surat mihrab, mihrab image, or shakl mihrab, mihrab shape. Just to underscore the distinction, 2-dimensional mihrab images are not intended to be physically functional in the sense of indicating the qibla or the direction of prayer. Rather, they function iconographically as illustrations with particular associations. Thus, to use the classic formulation of semiotic theory, the mihrab image is the signifier and the actual mihrab itself is the signified. But what exactly were the meanings invoked by these signs? The mihrab image's consistent appearance in funerary and devotional contexts suggests their primary purpose was commemorative, to indicate the presence of some special quality of sanctity associated with a place or a person. Indeed, every mihrab image whose original location is known comes from a shrine or a mausoleum, and they seem then to be intended to mark a place associated with death and commemoration. In addition, while obviously the lamp and candlesticks evoke the imagery of light directly, They also do so metaphorically by allusion to their signified, namely the three-dimensional mihrab. This is because three-dimensional mihrabs frequently invoke the light of God by including the Ayat al-Nur, the light verse from the Quran, a verse that describes God as the light of heaven and the earth and embraces the metaphor of a lamp brighter than the stars. The mihrab image then, while distinct from three-dimensional mihrabs, is still visually and aesthetically linked to their meaning. Perhaps we may say that the mihrab image embodies a series of nested iconographic associations, some of which are physical, the representation of a three-dimensional object, some of which are metaphorical, allusions to the light of God, and some of which are contextual, location within spaces of commemoration. Uri claims the mihrab image was neutral from the perspective of sectarian associations and was not attached to any single esoteric Muslim perception, as she puts it. However, if we look carefully at the examples she provides, we find that of the 16 shrines she examines, 10 are spaces devoted to the Alids, or members of the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet Muhammad. It's reasonable then to propose that the mihrab image may have had special significance for Shia worshippers. And yet at the same time, the symbolism of light was meaningful for Muslims, regardless of sectarian affiliation. What exactly then was the iconographic content of the mihrab image, and who would have been receptive to its message? Was it merely neutral iconographically, as Uri claims, or was it a site that functioned on a more complex level, a sign that functioned on a more complex level? Here, I'll propose that the mihrab image was not merely a generalized symbol of God's light, but was a polyvalent sign, one that signified differently depending on the holder of the visual narrative they constructed around the experience of encountering the imagery in its context. But how exactly did this work? 3 relatively unexplored examples of the mihrab image can give us some insight into this puzzle. The buildings in question are shrines devoted to 3 very different Islamic figures. The first, located in Aleppo, dedicated to Al-Hussein ibn Abi Talib. The second, also in Aleppo, to a figure named Al-Mohassen, who was virtually unknown elsewhere, but was believed by the Shi'is of Aleppo to be the miscarried child of Al-Hussein. And finally, the third, from Homs, dedicated to Khalid ibn al-Walid, the great military commander who led Muhammad's armies and later those of Abu Bakr and Umar in the conquest of Syria and Iraq. The first 2 figures are Alids, and their shrines played an important role in Shi'i devotion. The last, Khalid ibn al-Walid, is by contrast a great Sunni hero and a figure viewed by many Shi'is as virtually a war criminal for an incident in which he executed fellow Muslims. And yet these 3 shrines share the iconography of the mihrab image. The shrine of Khalid is located in a northern suburb of Homs, where he is believed to have been buried. The shrine has been known since at least Ayyubid times, when it was first mentioned by the pilgrimage guide author Ali al-Harawi. The shrine was originally attached to a mosque, but this configuration was altered by Saladin and then later by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who added a beautifully carved wooden cenotaph over the grave in 1265. In 1908, the shrine was demolished and the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II built the mosque that remains today on the site. The cenotaph was removed to the Damascus Museum. It is this cenotaph which bears the mihrab image, a pattern of lamps and pairs of candlesticks set within recessed and lobed arches, encircling the body of the casket. The cenotaph is made of sandalwood and is an example of Mamluk wood carving of the highest order. It has sustained considerable damage over the years, but the main elements of the decoration have been preserved. On each of the long faces are 6 mihrab images, largely identical. On the short face, a similar pattern of 3 more images are repeated. On one short face, a similar pattern of 3 more images are repeated. The other short face is taken up entirely by a large and highly visible plaque with an arched upper profile. This plaque contains the Ayatul Kursi, or throne verse, a majestic paean to the infinite power and inimitability of God. The throne verse, one of the most popular inscriptions in Islamic buildings generally, is frequently associated with themes pertaining to eschatology and eternal life. But it was also a key proof text in medieval polemic between the theological schools. Since here we are interested in the possible sectarian connotations of the associated mihrab image, the inclusion of the throne verse on our cenotaph is an interesting element. What themes did the throne verse explore? The first is simple: the power, infallibility, and the greatness of God. The primary theme of the verse is an expression of God's glory, vast, all-powerful, and ultimately beyond human comprehension. This is articulated forcefully in the image of the throne, which is said to extend over the heavens and the earth, and God feels no fatigue in guarding and preserving them. And this rhetorical allusion is the heart of the matter, for in the medieval period, the throne verse became a highly charged polemical text, precisely because its vivid imagery of God's throne sparked debate over the nature of divinity, and in particular, whether the image of a throne implied God's possession of physical form. For the most literal of interpreters, frequently adherents of the Sunni Hanbali school, the answer was that indeed God did have physical form. The opposing camp, which abhorred such literalism, accused its adherents of anthropomorphism, of giving God human attributes, which is considered, of course, a grave heresy. These opposing groups felt that God, in his greatness, could not possibly resemble humans, and that such verses could be accepted only on faith, bila kayf, or without asking how, acknowledging human limitations of understanding. Therefore, God might be described as having a hand, but this could not be a hand in the sense that we humans understand a hand. The Mu'tazili school, favored by Shi'is, advocated this second reading, holding that all such Quranic references must be interpreted metaphorically. Thus, while the throne verse by the Mamluk era the throne verse already had strong polemical associations. Let us turn now to our second example, the Mashhad Al-Mohassen. As noted previously, Al-Mohassen is an otherwise little-known figure who the Shi'i leaders of Aleppo decided must be the miscarried son of Al-Hussein. The shrine is located on a hillside overlooking the city. It was founded in the 10th century by a Shi'i, the Hamdanid ruler of Aleppo, Saif ad-Dawla. However, the building that stands today is a palimpsest of later additions and renovations largely pursued in the 12th and 13th centuries under the Sunni, Zengid, and Ayyubid dynasties. Its patrons included the Atabey Zengi, the great Sunni hero Nur ad-Din, and the Ayyubid Sultan of Aleppo, Al-Malik al-Zahir. In 1234, another Ayyubid Sultan, here's kind of a plan of the building. You can see that it's a kind of simple courtyard shape with a tomb chamber located in the upper left of this image. In 1234, another Ayyubid Sultan left an inscription inside the shrine. This inscription is perhaps the most enigmatic in the shrine, for it records an encomium for the 12 Shi'i imams, a surprising act for a Sunni sovereign. Generalized Sunni reverence for the family of the Prophet is one thing, but actually praising the leaders of Shi'ism in such a public context would seem to be quite another. It's partially explained, no doubt, by the little-known fact that for much of its medieval history, Aleppo was a Shi'i-dominated city. Thus, it would have made political sense for rulers to make gestures toward the Shi'i imams. In 1260, catastrophe befell the shrine when it was destroyed by the Mongols. Not long afterwards, Sultan Baybars, the patron of the cenotaph of Khalid, which we have just seen, also repaired this mashhad. Although the cenotaph inside the shrine has no date, it is nearly identical to that in the mausoleum of Khalid, and the flowing style of Naskhi calligraphy and repeating motifs of fleur-de-lis are common Mamluk emblems. Today, this cenotaph is rarely seen. It's in situ at the center of the tomb chamber behind a metal enclosure hidden beneath heavy carpets. On a visit in 2005, however, the caretakers opened the enclosure and lifted the carpets. Though missing its top and portions of its side panels, it is otherwise relatively well preserved. Like the cenotaph of Khalid, it is a rectangular casket, but here the decoration consists of a series of horizontally oriented rectangular panels divided by scrolling vegetal ornament. Each panel is bordered by a line of Naqshi calligraphy containing the Ayat al-Nur, or the light verse. Within each of the vertical panels is a repeating pattern of mihrab images, strikingly similar to those on the cenotaph of Khalid, and consisting of the now familiar pattern of a niche with a lamp hanging from its apex, flanked by 2 candlesticks. How was this iconography meant to be read and understood? Given the context, a historically Shi'i city and an Alid shrine long patronized by prominent Sunnis, the imagery may have been carefully calibrated to appeal simultaneously to both sects. Its generalized associations with the light of God would have been plain for Sunni viewers. But for Shi'is, the imagery may have functioned on a more complex level, referring to specific aspects of Shi'i theology that pertain to the role of light. Ali and the 12 imams, for example, are often described as being bearers of divine light, and the imamate was passed from one imam to the next via the transmission of such light. Al-Hussein is often represented as shining with divine light, or as himself being light, and imagery of the light of God inhabiting the bodies of holy Alid figures is common in Shi'i religious literature. Early Shi'i sources, such as Rustam Tabari, who died in 923, use such imagery. Other Shi'i traditions describe the Prophet's family as beings of light, and in general, Shi'i esoteric references to the Alids as the lights of the faith are common. The image of the lamp within a niche could thus have been meant to function as a polyvalent sign that simultaneously marked the space as a locus of general holiness and commemoration, made general reference to the light of God for the Sunnis via the Ayat al-Nur, and for Shi'is reminded the viewer that Al-Mohassen, as an Alid descendant, was designated as both the recipient and point of emanation of that holy light. This assumption about the polyvalent meaning of the mihrab image is made explicit in our third building, the Mashhad Al-Mohassen, located just 500 meters to the north of the Mashhad Al-Mohassen on that same hill overlooking the city of Aleppo. The Mashhad Al-Mohassen is one of the great Ayyubid era buildings, and in sheer aesthetic splendor easily competes with and even eclipses many of the more famous madrasas of the same period. It has been studied by several scholars, and yet it rarely appears in standard textbooks or architectural surveys. The main shrine area is accessed via a tall portal. The portal, elaborately carved and inlaid with stone interlace and a muqarnas hood, is the most prominent feature of a large walled enclosure that stretches eastward from the main shrine area. Like the Mashhad Al-Mohassen, this shrine was largely the work of a series of Sunni patrons, and the exquisite portal bears an inscription in the name of the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Malik al-Zahir and the date of its completion, 1195. But the portal is also a monument with a message, and that message includes the mihrab image. For under the splendid muqarnas half dome, a complex ideological position is communicated via 2 inscriptions. The first runs around the lateral faces of the portal bay, here and here, and is a reverent encomium for the 12 imams, similar to the one in the Mashhad Al-Mohassen. The second, located above the first and distributed over 3 large cells of muqarnas, decoration in the center back of the portal bay, is an inscription that is strongly Sunni in character. It praises the family of the Prophet, the first 4 Sunni caliphs, and expressly states that all the companions of the Prophet Muhammad are to be revered. It was no doubt intended as an admonishment for Shi'is to abandon the common practice of cursing the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. But situated prominently between them, as if visually mediating the two sectarian positions laid out in text, is a border consisting entirely of lamps containing, hanging within polylobe niches. And here, the polyvalent meaning of the mihrab image, somewhat vague in the shrine for Khalid ibn al-Walid and the Mashhad Al-Mohassen, becomes explicit. For the border visually harmonizes and integrates the two inscriptions and their seemingly opposing sectarian messages. Indeed, the viewer may not read the Shi'i inscription in full here on the lateral sides of the bay without following the border. Indeed, the viewer may not read the Shi'i inscription in full without first pausing in the center, following the border of the mihrab images upward to read the encomium for the Sahaba, before continuing to the remainder of the Shi'i inscription on the left lateral face of the portal. The band of mihrab images then becomes the primary element providing visual continuity between these two inscriptions. It functioned as a unifying rhetorical device intended to emphasize the possibility for coexistence and respect between the two seemingly opposite positions. In the three shrines I have presented here, it was precisely, and here, by the way, is that last inscription, which at the very end in the final little niche, Muqarna's niche says, "May God be pleased with all the companions of his prophet." In the three shrines I have presented here, it is precisely through such contextual details that the image of a lamp within a niche functioned as a polyvalent sign, whose meaning and significance changed according to context, but also in response to the narrative constructed through the act of viewing and reading and engaging with the image in association with its location, placement, and juxtaposition with other imagery and inscriptions. Here's a little example of the little lamps in case you'd like to look at those more closely. Here, in three holy sites devoted to three very different figures, the mihrab image was meant to be both deeply meaningful to Shi'is and yet ambiguous enough not to offend Sunnis. In this way, the mihrab image became a polyvalent sign, one that signified differently depending on the beholder and the visual narrative woven around the experience of encountering the imagery in its context. That it was able to do so speaks to the remarkable flexibility of Islamic iconography, which enables a richly nuanced means of seeing the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephennie. I am tempted to exploit this image of light as I pass the torch over to Nicholas Paul, our third speaker this afternoon. Dr. Paul is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center for Medieval Studies at Fordham University. This is already, okay, your presentation, perfect. His 2012 book, To Follow in Their Footsteps, The Crusades and Family Memory in the High Middle Ages, was awarded the John Nicholas Brown Prize of the Medieval Academy of America. He has also co-edited with Suzanne Yeager, Remembering the Crusades, Myth, Image, and Identity, and with Laura Morale, the excellent volume, The French of Outremer, Communities and Communication in the Crusading Mediterranean. Most recently, as mentioned above, he edited with a group of Fordham colleagues whose Middle Ages teachable moments for an ill-used past. Finally, he will also be publishing he will soon be publishing the edition and translation together with Wolfgang Müller of the 13th century relic-centered narrative, How the Holy Cross was brought from Antioch to the monastery of Bologna. The title of his talk this afternoon will be Ritual. Please, Dr. Paul.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I wanted to thank Daniela and Yoni for the invitation to speak at this really great, stimulating gathering. And thank you, Uri, for that introduction. I take pride, as I think has been mentioned, in having worked in different capacities with all the members of this session in the past few years. You will quickly discern that they are the real experts on these subjects. So to begin, The modern Italian literary masterpiece chronicling the waning of the old regime in the later 19th and early 20th century Sicily, Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa's 1957 novel Il Gattopardo, translated as The Leopard, concludes with a chapter entitled Relics, May 1910. The final chapter describes the lives of 3 older women, all that remains of the once great family of Salina. Their world, already faded, is dealt a final blow when the Cardinal Archbishop of Palermo comes to visit the family chapel to inspect and authenticate and ultimately to destroy its substantial collection of relics, one of the last sources of aristocratic pride. With its detailed description of a traditional Ancien Regime society drawn from the author's own memories, de Lampedusa's novel has for many years attracted the attention of medievalists. Most recently, Julia Smith cited the final chapter as an example of, quote, contrasting assumptions about what relics were. One, subjective, intuitive, familial, and deeply traditional. The other, the product of the modern, professionally trained ecclesiastical establishment, unquote. Smith goes on to demonstrate that the assumptions of the professionally trained ecclesiastical establishment and subjective attitudes towards sacred stuff, the assumptions of the professionally trained ecclesiastical establishment had developed over the post-medieval period and bore little relation to the pluralist, fuzzy, and subjective attitudes towards sacred stuff that we find in the Middle Ages. This distinction is critically important, but looking again at the story of the Salina sisters demonstrates that there may be further distinctions to make. The relic collection of the Salina sisters is an inherently aristocratic one. It is located within their familial chapel, where private chaplains say masses. Lampedusa's description highlights its elite nature. This is what he says of it. Quote, the relics are completely covered the 2 walls on either side of the altar. Each was enclosed in a frame which also contained a card with information about it and a number referring to the documents of authentication. These documents themselves, often voluminous and hung with seals, were locked in a damask-covered chest in a corner of the chapel. They were frames of worked and smooth silver, frames of bronze and coral, frames of tortoiseshell, in filigree, in rare woods, in boxwood, in red and blue velvet, frames worth a fortune, and frames bought at the Bocconi stores, unquote. Other elements also seek to place the Salina devotional culture squarely within the context of social status. The image hanging over the altar, which the sisters insist is a representation of the Madonna of the Letter of Messina, is quite obviously a romantic painting of a young woman reading a letter from her lover. The relic collection is juxtaposed, moreover, with another collection of memorabilia, including the skin of their father's hunting dog, the Great Dane Bendico, now used as a rug in the room. The treatment of the family's relic collection, including the courtly painting and the dog's pelt, highlights not only differing notions of authority in the classification of sacred material, but the existence of larger categories of symbolic and ritual objects, of which the sacred might constitute only a part. The final chapter of Il Gattopardo, moreover, offers a simple equivalence. The destruction of such material is a metaphor for the end of the dynasty and of nobility more generally. The world of the Salina family actually ends in the 20th century, but it points to a general truth about a culture of aristocracy in Europe that had prevailed since the 12th century. It was from that time forward that regimes of interpersonal lordship came to be systematically and ultimately legally allied with the mythology of inherently virtuous and exclusive bloodlines, the race of nobility, as it came to be called in France. This regime of nobility and its supporting myths could only be maintained through the continuous and ostentatious performance of status. Noble status was articulated in gestures, clothing, speech, and in the mastery of specialized knowledge, for instance, about hunting practices and story worlds. For men, principally, it was also expressed in the new expectations surrounding military conduct and the specialized skills associated with equestrian combat. That status was held up by an extensive material culture. A perfect illustration of the masculine embodiment of nobility is this famous image of the virtues battling the vices in William Peraldus's Summa of Vices. You'll notice that each of the virtues is assigned to a different piece of knightly equipment. For female lords, The material scaffolding of nobility, including books, jewelry, purses, animals, and reliquaries, was no less rich. In a specific way, then, we can understand high medieval aristocracy as coterminous with a kind of expertise in ritual objects, a specialized knowledge about how certain types of material could function to activate nobility in charged contexts. It's no surprise that the earliest guide to entering the life of knighthood, the Ordre de Chevalerie, explains the rite of passage through a series of ritual engagements with objects, specific kinds of objects. In the very earliest stage of the growth of this European culture of nobility, an international group of aristocrats, led and commanded by no monarch, had participated in the extraordinary Christian holy war that we call the First Crusade. Between 1096 and 1099, they conquered a series of Armenian Christian, Byzantine, Seljuk, and Fatimid-held towns and fortresses, establishing in the process a network of principalities ruled by a French-speaking feudal elite that are today sometimes called the Crusader states, the Latin East, or the Frankish Levant. For the next 2 centuries, these Frankish territories survived on the Eastern Mediterranean littoral, supported by, or one might have said, in spite of, a further major series of crusade campaigns. Now, in my previous research, I tried to address the phenomenon of different types of material that was acquired or used in the context of crusading, some of which is what we might call traditional sacred objects or relics, but also other material that we might not, which was then placed into proprietary spaces and sometimes explicitly into ritual contexts associated with European aristocratic families. I argued that this material, regardless of other functions or meanings, might be given by clerical or intellectual, or other meanings given by clerical or intellectual hermeneutics, in fact, functioned as a kind of memorabilia, which in turn helped to generate and sustain a continuous discourse over time with reference to the Crusades. This discourse about the Crusades was in turn inextricably tied to operations of status and power in Europe. What I would like to do today is to broach with you a difficult question, which quickly turns into several very difficult questions. If we turn not to the aristocracy of Europe, but to the Frankish aristocracy of the Latin East, what can we say about their use of ritual objects? Did they use material culture in similar ways to the European aristocracy? What was their role as protector, acquirer, and mediator of ritual objects as they lived in a zone whence the European elites derived so much of their sacred stuff? There are several reasons why these are difficult questions, and I promise you right now that I'm not going to be able to answer any of them. First, there is the problem about the survival of evidence. Textual sources deposited in the Cairo Geniza, carried away to Damascus and Constantinople by displaced communities, or evacuated to Cyprus or Italy before the final fall of Acre to Mamluk forces in 1291, have much to offer, but they also leave much to be desired. We know from the survival of liturgical books and the great treatises of feudal custom copied in Cyprus, for instance, much about the rich coronation regalia for the rulers of the kingdom. It included, in a recognizably European fashion, a sword, a crown, an orb, and a ring, but it also featured a scepter, less common, and the banner of the kingdom. Lists from ecclesiastical treasuries also named sumptuous garments for the higher clergy, and the customary treatise of John of Evelyn discerns between the abbots of the great monasteries on the basis of their liturgical vestments, what they're allowed to wear. But this level of detail is not available for the nobility. The survival of the great treatises on feudal custom, for instance, gives us an intimate look at the many rituals enacted before the high courts, some of which invoke relics or gospel books for oath swearing, the harnesses and furnished beds to which all knights are entitled, and the weapons and fighting for the fighting of judicial duels. We don't know, however, where most of this same aristocracy was buried, nor anything of their tomb architecture. We know little of their households, whether they possessed their own liturgical spaces and personnel, chapels and chaplains, and we know relatively little about their patronage of local religious institutions. What the relics were, therefore, that they had to hand to resolve, what relics were there, therefore, when they wanted to resolve their disputes? Were they the same type as the Passion relics so avidly sought by crusaders and pilgrims? Or would they reveal a more intimate relationship with local shrines, even those popular with non-Latin Christians? Does living at the end of the Pilgrim's Trail inure a society to the glamour of great shrine that co-religionists seek with such fervor? And I ask that question because I live about 10 minutes from Times Square, and I would happily never see it again, this place where so many people flock as pilgrims. Lacking wills and testaments, we know little or nothing in practice of the way that they distributed movables and cash within their families, or their cult preferences, or their frequency of book ownership. Second, there is the problem related to how we interpret this little evidence that we have. Because this elite could speak and they wrote, at least the works that we have, mainly in French, and they assumed familiar European titles and names and adopted very prominent personal signifiers in common with Europeans, such as heraldry and seals, it is clear that they existed along a continuum of symbolic material with their European cousins. But according to reports from Europe, the way they deployed some of these familiar signifiers was novel and surprising. And over all of this hangs the pernicious specter of origins and influence. Scholars of medieval Europe for centuries have ignored the fact that many central features of supposedly European aristocratic culture, for instance, the Round Table Tournament, actually appear for the first time in the Latin East, preferring to assume that the Franks of the Levant received these influences from the West. The same problem exists, in my view, for arguments among art historians that the clothing of the Latin East that we see in their images was distinctively Byzantine. We could ask which way the influence runs, or we could just conclude that they existed within a fluid Mediterranean society that was inherently hybrid and polyglot. Now, I asked at the outset here, what use did the aristocracy of the Latin East make of ritual objects, and what do those objects have to do with the maintenance of aristocratic status? In response, taking account of the serious limitations and challenges that we face in addressing this question, I'm going to make two observations and one speculation on this point. The first observation is that there is good evidence that the kinds of sacred relics prized by the Eastern aristocracy could be very similar to the ones sought out by pilgrims and crusaders. For one thing, the aristocracy of the Latin East were the ones who often chose the reliquaries sent to the West or gifted to visitors. Also, of course, the totemic object of the early kingdom of Jerusalem before 1187 was a great relic of the true cross, carried out into battle by the king and the royal host and carried back in triumph after victory. It is easy to see how the use of this great passionate relic both symbolized the triumphal sacrifices of the crusaders who had founded the kingdom and also granted a clear identity to its warrior elite, defenders of the cross. They also defended the site of biblical action, the ground from which the precious relics could theoretically arise. A Latin narrative that I've been editing with a colleague of mine from Fordham tells the story of a knight, Manasses of Liège, who rose to become the constable of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the decade between 1141 and 1152. Toward the end of this period, the narrative relates that he was given a gift by the widowed Princess Constance of Antioch, the cross which her husband Raymond of Poitiers had borne before him in battle with the army of Antioch. That relic was also a cross, and it may actually be this cross, preserved today in the treasury of the Cathedral of Namur. If this reliquary is in fact the same one that the constable brought back from Jerusalem, then it is very similar to a number of other cross reliquaries, essentially the ones that Anne was just showing us, thought to have been produced in the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century. So there's one from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and there's a whole bunch of them as collected by Nicholas Jaspers. Now, the narrative about Manasses and his cross contains important details about how the object was revered by the Eastern aristocracy. Manasses's friend, Philip of Nablus, was said to have punctured the wood of the relic, making it bleed, and representatives of the kingdom are sent to try and acquire the relic from Manasses after he's banished from the kingdom and starts to head home. When Manasses ultimately returned home to the county of Namur, he built a new chapel for the relic, precisely the kind of space that we have so little information about in the Latin East. He also continued to carry it into battle against his enemies. The story of Manasses and the Holy Cross of Antioch points to a culture of ritual objects in the Latin East that appears more conventional within Latin Christian devotional traditions. My second example shows how the local political context of the Kingdom of Jerusalem could expand the potential range of ritual stuff. Inside the precincts of the castle of Angers, capital of the county of Anjou in western France, was a collegiate church whose canons worked in the administration of the powerful counts of Anjou. A brief set of customs of this collegiate church, apparently written toward the end of the 12th century, records the form in which the new counts should be received when they arrive in Angers. The customs say that, quote, when a count has been newly created, or every time he returns from an absence or long pilgrimage, he should come to the church where he should be solemnly received by the chapter and the priests of Saint-Lô. The count, together with their countess and their children, should also be attended to and received by the dean or by whoever will be the first prior of the same church with the Bible and the thurible and holy water, carrying to the same count in the said reception the ivory tau, the tau Ebereum, that King Fulk of Jerusalem, Count of Anjou, gave to the said church. He had it from the Sultan of Babylon, who when he himself was crowned in Jerusalem. And I, Guy of Athay, and the whole chapter of the church and the clerics have received counts of Anjou in this way. And the said King Fulk gave the said tau to our church that we should thus receive counts. And this he instructed, and this he willed, to signify that the counts of Anjou are the lords and abbots of the church of Saint-Lô above all other clerics. Now this text has been interpreted to preserve the story of a real coronation present, sent to Fulk of Anjou at the time of his coronation as king of Jerusalem in 1131 by the Egyptian vizier Qutayfat. Michael Brett links the apparent act of détente between Qutayfat and the Franks with the appointment of a new Coptic patriarch after an interregnum of 6 years, and refers to both actions, the sending of the tau and the election of the patriarch, as, quote, the employment of Christianity to effect a reconciliation with the Franks, unquote. I have not been able to ascertain whether the object that canons describe as an ivory tau would be any more likely to have originated with the Coptic community than within Fatimid workshops. Some museum catalogs do contain listings for objects that they call Coptic ivory tau staff heads, but upon closer inspection, the provenance and dating becomes much less certain. Given the reach of the Coptic patriarch south through Ethiopia, I've also wondered whether the mysterious ivory tau could have something to do with Mukumia Ethiopian prayer sticks, which also have a tau shape and sort of fulfill the same kind of function as the head of a staff, as this object seems to have done. Whatever the object's origins, what seems most important about the ivory tau for our purposes is that it was an object that came to Fulk from an Islamicate context outside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but that having received it in one ritual moment, the moment of his coronation, he had decided to forever enshrine it as a ritual object in a non-royal aristocratic context. This could potentially be early evidence for what would later become the deliberate acquisition of material from outside the kingdom for use in explicitly aristocratic rituals. It is a process that was certainly well known by the 14th century, when we find no fewer than 3 separate silver dining vessels produced in the workshops of Egypt for the Lusignan rulers of Cyprus. Covered in Arabic inscriptions praising the ruler and finished with the heraldic devices of the Lusignan king, these items suggest the existence of an aristocratic material culture that was easily legible, if not increasingly identical, between elites and across confessional lines. So it is with these twin ideas of the acquisition of alien material and the development of shared elite cultures that I want to turn with my final example, which, as I mentioned, is pure speculation. Abundant evidence from European and Near Eastern sources attests to the popularity of hunting in the Latin East. The great observer of Frankish foibles, Usama ibn Munkid of the Banu Munkid, who were lords of Shaizar, tells many stories of his own hunting adventures on the borders of the Latin kingdom. Confirming his stories about the popularity of hunting, we know that the king of Jerusalem, who he knew as Fulk ibn Fulk, the same Fulk who received the ivory tau at his coronation, was himself killed in a hunting accident in 1143 when his horse stumbled while he was hunting a hare with a full royal hunting party. Artists of the Latin East who encountered this scene in histories illustrated it as follows. They capture, in the moment before his death, Fulk engaged in a quintessential performance of aristocratic privilege, hunting, and bearing the object symbolic of that privilege, the hunting horn. Fine hunting horns made from the tusks of elephants, cut and prepared for export in Islamicate North Africa, constitute one of the most well-represented bodies of secular elite art objects in contemporary collections. Generations of art historians have disagreed about how to classify the decorative styles and programs of these objects, some of which were still, to my horror, described as Saracenic style, with some proposing that they were produced in Egypt, while others argue that they were made in Norman Sicily. To my knowledge, no one has ever considered any possible relationship with the Latin East, although no region of the Mediterranean is better attested for Latin Christian hunting practices in Islamicate contexts, precisely what the Oliphants seem to embody. Most recently, Marion Rosser Owen has drawn attention to the place of the Oliphant alongside other types of horns in European collections and asked why they survived. Large numbers of horns found their way into church treasuries, not only because they were used to carry precious Eastern relics, but also because they were used as symbols of land tenure that had been surrendered to the church. In both cases then, oliphants manufactured in Islamicate contexts finally appear in Western Europe as aristocratic ritual objects. And you can actually see that they also all share this feature that they have been hung up, right? They've got these rings added to them so they can be publicly displayed and hung. So the Oliphants fit neatly with our first two examples of the Holy Cross of Antioch and the Tau of Anjou. The link I draw between them and the Latin East must at this point be conjectural, although it is worth noting that when writers in northern France set to work creating a mythological origin story for the First Crusade, they did so in a series of tales about how the conquest of the Holy Land was prophesied to the grandmother and mother of Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lorraine. The symbol of Godfrey's destiny and the conquest of Jerusalem to be safeguarded, and which was then handed to him upon his departure with the Crusade expedition, was described as a white horn, represented like this in 13th century illuminated manuscripts. I'll conclude acknowledging that we have not gone very far forward toward answering the questions I set out in this paper. In the Latin East, we are presented with an aristocracy that displays many of the same superficial characteristics as the nobility of medieval Europe. In addition to sharing a European Mediterranean tongue, French, the Outremer aristocracy was certainly an avid participant in a cultural world in which European knights and visiting noblewomen felt at home. If we abandon any assumption based on superficial similarities between the two and acknowledge the richness of the cultural encounter that was taking place in Syria and Palestine, we must acknowledge that we know relatively little about the role of ritual objects or any other element in the maintenance of aristocratic status in the Crusader states. The three examples that I shared, however, all signal the fact that the Frankish aristocracy of the Latin East was seeking out material underpinnings for their hegemonic status, whether they were reliquaries, ivory staffs, or hunting horns. This is most definitely just the tip of the iceberg for a vast array of elite materials that was acquired and trafficked by the nobility of Outremer. We might guess that most of that material, consisting of textiles, high-status animals, and furniture, can never be recovered. Importantly, though, the three examples that I shared demonstrate the role of the Frankish aristocracy as experts in the acquisition of such material and its proper citing into aristocratic rituals. It may help us explain why, when the nobility of Europe imagined an expert who would explain chivalry and especially the material process of entering into knighthood, the figure they imagined explaining knighthood was Hugh of Tiberias, a member of the Frankish aristocracy.
Thank you, Nick. This was quite literally mind-blowing, and also the degree to which the papers have been talking to each other so far is really astonishing. But before we can explore these connections further, we promptly turn to the fourth and final speaker this afternoon, whom I will introduce. William Purkis is reader in medieval history at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He is a historian of medieval religious cultures with particular interests in crusading and Latin Christian traditions of pilgrimage and monasticism. His publications include a monograph on crusading spirituality in the Holy Land and Iberia, published in 2008, and a co-edited special issue of the journal Material Religion entitled Material Religion in the Crusading World, published in 2018. In 2017, he curated an exhibition on Holy City, Holy War, Devotion to the Sacred in Crusader Jerusalem at the Museum of the Order of St. John in London. He is currently completing a book on the devotional ideas and practices of Crusaders and other Latin Christians associated with the crusading movement, to be published soon, I hope, by Yale University Press. The microphone is yours, Dr. Perkis.
Thanks so much, and thanks also to Daniela and Yoni for organising this event over this week. It's been a great source of enjoyment and so energising so far to be thinking about the Middle Ages seriously in a sustained way for what seems like the first time in a long time, certainly for me. Okay, so the period of Latin rule over Jerusalem between 1099 and 1187 witnessed a surge in the numbers of pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land from across the medieval Christian world. From Iceland to Ethiopia, devotees of the God-man Jesus made their way to the Loca Sancta to visit and venerate the various sacred sites and holy objects that were so integral to their religious identities. In a famous passage describing his Holy Land journey of around 1170, the German pilgrim John of Würzburg attested to the presence in Jerusalem of Greeks, Latins, Germans, Hungarians, Bulgars, Scots, Navarrese, Bretons, English, Franks, Russians, Bohemians, Georgians, Armenians, Syrians, Jacobites, Nestorians, Indians, Egyptians, Copts, Catholics, Maronites, and many others, which would be a long task to list. Among the consequences of this significant uptick in Christian pilgrim traffic was a concomitant rise in the demand for sacred souvenirs from the Loca Sancta. In this paper, I'm going to consider some of the ways in which Jerusalem's Latin Christian elites sought to meet the demands of this new pilgrim market. And I'm going to examine some of the more entrepreneurial souveniring practices that emerged within the city and its holy hinterland during the course of the 12th century. In so doing, I'll explore the interplay between the creators and the consumers of sacred material culture and the opportunities for creativity that the medieval Jerusalem pilgrimage industry presented. One type of holy souvenir that was mass produced for pilgrims who travelled to Latin Jerusalem during the 12th century was the small, cheap flask, normally made of lead, known as an ampulla. The manufacture of ampullae for distribution to Jerusalem pilgrims was not an innovation of the Crusader period. Between the 4th and the mid-7th centuries, during the Byzantine custody of the Holy Land, pilgrims to Jerusalem and other sacred sites across the Near East were accustomed to acquiring empty flasks and filling them with blessings, eulogiae, of holy oil, water, dust, or earth. One anonymous traveller from around 570, known simply as the Piacenza pilgrim, left a detailed account of the devotional practices relating to these ampullae, describing how such objects were filled with oil and then sanctified through direct contact with a relic of the true cross. And the pilgrim's account included a recollection of how this worked in practice. He stated that when the mouth of one of the little flasks touches the wood of the cross, the oil instantly bubbles over, and unless it is closed very quickly, it all spills out. A number of clay and metal ampullae from the Byzantine period are extant, most of which have been dated to the late 6th or the early 7th centuries. However, the trail of evidence for the production of Holy Land ampullae goes cold for the centuries following the Arab conquest of the 7th century, only to pick up once again with objects that originate from the period of Latin rule over the holy places. Evidently then, following the conquest of 1099, those who were responsible for the management of the Jerusalem pilgrim experience set about reviving this aspect of the late antique pilgrim industry. To my knowledge, there are only 4 12th century Crusader ampullae extant in museum collections, 2 in Berlin, 1 in London, and 1 in Cleveland. There is also a 5th ampulla that has been dated to the Crusader period and is now in the Malcove collection in Toronto. But this object is so worn that it's difficult to assign it to the 12th century with any confidence. From an aesthetic point of view, there is nothing particularly remarkable about these ampullae. They are crude, functional objects rather than works of fine art. Nevertheless, the iconography of the ampullae is of great significance, since it both authenticated the provenance and announced the importance of the holy contents sealed within. A common feature across 3 out of the 4 surviving Crusader ampullae is a depiction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this depiction is perhaps most readily intelligible from the sketch on the right, which is of the surviving object in London. So here we see both a conflation of the exterior and the interior of the building. And I think the exterior would have been immediately recognizable to 12th century viewers from the image of the church's 2 signature domes, shown here and here, and its recently erected bell tower, shown on the right there. While the building's interior is revealed through distinctive shape and slight upwards curvature. I think it's more apparent on the actual object itself. The slight upwards curvature of the Anastasis Rotunda. Moreover, at the heart of the image is an iconographical feature that proclaims the particular sacrality of the ampulla and its contents. Here we see Christ's dead body wrapped in a shroud, the presence of which thus collapsed the distance between the 1st century past, when Christ had lain in his rock-cut tomb, and the 12th century present, when his then empty Holy Sepulchre was surrounded by the magnificent church that had been rebuilt by the Latins. So by playing fast and loose with chronology in this way, the designers of this iconography were able to underscore that whilst Christ's body was long gone, his sacred energy continued to run through the building's fabric many centuries later. So this is very much the same sort of ideas that stimulated devotion to the Stone of Unction, as we heard yesterday. The ampullae were manufactured with suspension loops, which suggests that they were designed to be worn close to the body, probably as pendants. And as a brief aside, this stained glass window from Canterbury Cathedral, which has recently been dated to the mid-1180s, depicts pilgrims at the shrine of St. Thomas carrying ampullae around their necks. So it seems reasonable to conclude that contemporary Jerusalem pilgrims would have been behaving in much the same way. Given the modest size of the ampullae, it's also possible to imagine these objects being cradled between the bearer's thumb and forefinger, perhaps with the embossed depiction of the Holy Sepulchre being caressed with the thumb as a devotional stimulant. Indeed, on the ampulla that is now in Cleveland, this example here, which measures 4.3 centimeters by 2.9 centimeters, the image of the sepulchre itself shows signs of considerable wear. What might these ampullae have contained? It's possible that they may have been acquired by pilgrims as empty vessels to be filled with whatever stuff might have been desired and then sealed with a plug of some description. The rim of the Cleveland ampulla yawns open, perhaps anticipating its sacred cargo and then a cork stopper, while the London ampulla is crimped shut and appears to have teeth marks at its rim, suggesting that its closure may have been the work of an amateur. Equally, it's also possible that ampullae may have been acquired preloaded and pre-sealed with sacred contents. The iconography of the Ampullae indicates that the Holy Sepulchre is the most likely point of origin for their sacred contents. Given the particular prominence of lamps in the object's iconography, it's reasonable to suppose that holy oil, probably from the lamps that illuminated the edicule, the rotunda, and the wider church complex, were a likely source of sacred liquor. But oil need not be the only source of sacred matter acquired by pilgrims to the Holy Sepulchre, and material evidence suggests a wider range of more entrepreneurial activities that were also being practiced at the site. As with many popular tourist destinations, medieval and modern, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is covered in graffiti. Perhaps the most famous of these are the countless numbers of signs of the cross that have been scratched or carved into the walls and other parts of the building's fabric, many of which can be found in and around the Chapel of St. Helena and the Chapel of the Invention of the Cross at the church's east end. Although it's difficult to know for sure when these crosses were made, or indeed who was responsible for their creation, until recently they have generally been attributed to the craftsmanship of pilgrims, and most commonly dated to the 12th century. Given the increased numbers of pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem during the Crusader period, these both seem like plausible assumptions. But I suggest there's another possibility, and one that links the creation of cross graffiti with the evident 12th century enthusiasm for seeking and finding tangible souvenirs of the holy places. One feature that distinguishes the cross marks in the staircase and chapel of St. Helena is how ordered and programmatic they are. The cross graffiti on the walls of this part of the building are far more consistent than those found elsewhere in the church, both in terms of size and shape, and the cross marks are also typically grouped together in neat rows and columns. In the staircase down to the Chapel of St. Helena, the surface areas of some of the wall stones have been completely covered with crosses, exhausting all the available space. Other stones appear to be incomplete works in progress, with a pattern of cross marks having been initiated on one side before the carving process was apparently suspended at a later date. The professionalism and consistency of this graffiti makes it improbable that it was executed in an ad hoc fashion by numerous untrained hands, and it begs the question whether it should in fact be understood as graffiti at all. Recent photogrammetric analysis of the crosses carved into the apses of the Chapel of St. Helena has concluded that the crosses were produced, quote, by someone with time and motivation and the appropriate tools to leave his mark, unquote. Rather than the handiwork of visiting pilgrims then, it seems far more plausible that the majority of cross marks throughout this part of the building were created by a group of masons who are more skilled, better equipped, and no doubt working with the approval and probably at the commission of the church's Latin custodians. With this in mind, it should be remembered that the process by which the presence of a cross was created through fashioning an absence within the church's walls was noteworthy not only for the symbol that it left engraved permanently in the building's fabric, but also for the small, but by no means trivial, material byproduct that it would have generated, stone dust. It's evident from the iconography of the 12th century pilgrimage ampullae that medieval Latins understood the fabric of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself to be charged with Christ's virtus, the sacred power that had flowed from his body to irradiate everything that it touched, creating all manner of holy places and objects. The chapels of St. Helena and of the Invention of the Cross were among those parts of the Holy Sepulchre complex that were felt to be particularly resonant with virtus, since it was this part of the building that the true cross had lain buried, or rather, it was where the true cross had lain buried that this building was constructed, this part of the building was constructed around. So the true cross had lain here underground, emanating sacred power for around 300 years before its dramatic unearthing in the 4th century, a moment that's captured on this late 12th century reliquary from Limoges. And of course, the site of this, this event is where the chapels of St. Helena of the Invention of the Cross were constructed to surround. So it's only natural that this was one part of the church that might have been regarded as particularly rich pickings for those seeking holy souvenirs, and perhaps only natural that during the Crusader period, the church's Latin custodians sought to respond to the devotional demands of an ever-increasing number of relic-hungry pilgrims. As they went about their work in and around the chapel of St. Helena, the Holy Sepulchre's masons were therefore not only engaged in marking the church's walls with the sign of the cross, they were also in the vanguard of 12th century attempts to industrialize the supply of relics. I suggest that the full significance of the surviving cross marks lies in the evidence they provide for a substantial and coordinated operation within the Holy Sepulchre to mine for sacred matter. There's some evidence to suggest that these innovative extraction processes may have been replicated at a number of Jerusalem's other Christian holy places. Similar signs of the cross can be found, for example, marked into the walls of the 12th century Armenian Cathedral of St. James, including on the columns of the gallery before the west front and towards the south end of the internal face of the church's western wall, where they are exhibited and protected today beneath the pane of glass. A small number of well-fashioned crosses are also visible inside both the entrance and the exit of the empty tomb of the Virgin in the Church of St. Mary in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Here too, same site, more rudimentary cross graffiti have been scratched into the right-hand wall of the staircase that descends to the crypt. And I think the makeshift nature of the symbols on the photograph on the right underscores the distinctiveness and the artistry of those cross marks found elsewhere. However, the surviving evidence for cross-marking traditions at both of these sites is limited compared to what survives for the Holy Sepulchre. Here, the creation and collection of stone dust relics can probably be directly linked with the revival in the manufacture of pilgrimage ampullae, with one group of 12th century craftsmen being tasked with producing cheap metal containers, and a second being responsible for generating their priceless contents. Indeed, the iconography of the ampullae may even point to the presence of sacred stone dust within, since the sign of the cross, the symbol from which the dust may have originated, figures prominently on the necks of all 4 surviving examples. Residue analysis of the interior of these ampullae may yield further insights still. Through the production, acquisition and movement of ampullae from the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem to Western Europe, tiny particles of matter, all rich with the power of the Holy Sepulchre's sacred energy, could thus be relocated to the heartlands of Latin Christendom. Although nowhere near as grand as major relics of the Passion and their glittering reliquary containers, with which we began, and certainly lacking in the sorts of textual validation that frequently accompanied the translations and arrivals of more prestige objects, these ampullae and their sacred contents could serve not only as a keepsake of an individual's Jerusalem pilgrimage, but also as a portal through which the holy places, and by extension Christ himself, might have been seen, touched and venerated by larger numbers of the medieval Christian faithful. Thanks very much.
Thank you so very much, William, and to all 4 speakers for this really tremendously rich interventions. We have exactly 20 minutes left to discuss the matters that were risen here. So the floor is open. Please raise your hand and I will, yeah. So Eyal, do you want to go first?
Yes, thanks very much. And thanks for all four speakers for really fascinating papers. I'm wondering about, William hinted at that at the very end, but I'm wondering both for Anne's paper and for William's about the use of primarily heritage sign technology in the analysis of objects, because I think that the problem we're all facing is that we're stuck with this object with very little additional information, and we're trying to gather as much as we can. So first for William, I may possibly, have you tried XRFing the objects?
Sorry, the sound just broke up there. Try doing what, sorry?
XRF, probably not macro XRF, but XRF itself.
No, I mean, I had a preliminary conversation with colleagues in Cleveland about doing some examination of the objects, but it didn't get beyond the preliminary. And I think the potential for doing it, any sort of more detailed analysis of the objects, I think the London example is, the British Museum is, I suspect, the most promising, but I don't know quite how destructive that any sort of investigations like would be.
No, the XRF might be useful because it's just projects an X-ray beam, so it's not, it doesn't damage the object at all, and it's non-intrusive. So it's just from the outside. It might be a problem because of the lead content, but then it might be just needed the right angle. But it provides an in-depth molecular analysis of all components within that. So that might be a useful way of looking into that.
That's a great tip. Thank you very much.
And for Anne, I was wondering also about that and the kind of usage and maybe the possibility of combining that with this kind of Kate Rudy's work on used books and measuring of dirt. That might be an interesting way of thinking about how these objects were used and whether or not there are elements that have been more heavily touched than others, and then remapping that. That might be interesting, because I think it's a fascinating test case. But then, you know, when you have this composite object, was it all used in the same way? Did people at the time view it in the same way? This is, I was wondering if it is something you're working on as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I haven't gotten that far with specific objects in the sense, you know, and I think we're hampered by objects that are in these superstar collections, right? And what you may or may not be able to do with them. And then some things that are sort of tucked away in perhaps less well-known collections where there just simply is more access on the part of some researchers some of the time. And I think when one finds those collections, that's really exciting. And, you know, in terms of that kind of analysis, I'm at the moment really interested in pursuing projects having to do with still extant reliquary bursa or purse, you know, the alms purses that actually are far more widespread and survive far more than I had ever imagined. And I think were some of the ways in which these small crosses and small reliquaries were carried back and forth, particularly among aristocrats. So I think that, you know, there are levels of analysis that one could do with that. And Sharon Farmer, for example, has done in an article about sort of the global connections of an alms purse that's later 14th century in the context of Paris. An incredible analysis at almost every level of how the purse was constructed and the kinds of labor regimes that went into producing it and where, you know, where it would have moved. So I think it's a wonderful ambition. I just haven't, you know, gotten that far. There is that book, Relics in the Lab, that was produced by a team of scholars out of the Netherlands, which is a fantastic exposition of what you can do with X-ray analysis in terms of some of these different objects, but I haven't done it. I should say in the French context, most of the relics no longer survive in any, I mean, most of them are empty. And in fact, I think there's still just, you know, dispute whether or not the objects that look like crosses to us in the Yacour example are actually wood or sort of a kind of wax and putty put together. I don't know. I haven't held it in my own hand, alas. Thanks, Eyal.
Lawrence, you have a question and a comment?
Yes, thank you. Well, thanks to all four speakers for fantastic papers. Maybe first the comment to what William presented, the little crosses on the walls of the staircase. I think the fabric of these crosses, the particular shape in which they are incised, is practically the same as the crosses on facades of churches in Armenia. Maybe you've come across that already 1,000 times. I'm just mentioning it here. For example, at the monasteries of Sanahin and Harpat. At Sanahin, it's in the main church. At Harpat, it's on the facade of the Zamatun. And there the crosses are combined with other inscriptions and high relief crosses. So that might have to do with the structural history of the Chapel of St. Helen in Jerusalem. My question is to Stephennie, and first of all, congratulations to having managed to see the shrine at the Mashhad Al-Mohassen. That's fantastic. That's absolutely marvelous. And so the question is iconographic. You presented the rectangular panels on the side, and there is the hanging lamp and the two candlesticks. And what is the motive in between?
Are you talking about Mashhad Al-Mohassen?
Yes, yes.
The fleur-de-lis motif, you mean?
Yeah, it looked like a fleur-de-lis.
Yeah, it is, yep. Which is, I mean, you see that in Mamluk blazons, right?
Okay, fine. Yeah, it wasn't completely clear. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. It only occurred to me that there is something there when it was almost disappearing from the screen, and yes, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really firmly ties it to the Mamluk period, which makes sense if Baybars is the patron.
Oh yes, I think that's a very good dating proposal. Yes.
Yeah.
Although it's not completely clear why the fleur-de-lis would, I mean, yeah, what the iconographic value of it would be in this context. Mm-hmm. Okay,
I think it's sort of like, I think, a little royal insignia inserted between the two candlesticks of the sort that you would normally see on the candlestick, right? It's a way of kind of projecting it upward, I think, in space so that it's more visible in this really small area.
Well, then the question would be, why is it royal when Baybars, is there a connection between Baybars and the fleur-de-lis?
No, there is a connection, and I have to say I haven't followed it up fully. It's something I need to dig a little bit more deeply into. Usually, I mean, as you know, usually it would refer to their previous, status at court. But yeah, you're right. That's something I need to explore a little bit more. So thank you for reminding me about that.
Yeah. Sorry, can I ask one little more thing?
Please go ahead.
From Stephennie. You on the Mashhad Al-Hussein, you presented the Shiite and the Sunni inscription wonderfully, and the frieze with the lamps in between.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the arches in that frieze do actually represent mihrabs?
So I think they're mihrab images, right? So just as we've seen elsewhere, this kind of little edicule form, right, can take a lot of different shapes. It's both a frieze, it's both a decorative element, and I think it would be evocative of the mihrab image. So again, this is not a mihrab, right? It's meant to represent the idea of mihrabness, like the idea of, it's like a kind of little focal point of sanctity that I think carried a lot of different associations. And that was really, the longer article that I published about this really explored themes of kind of materiality and agency and the ways in which, reception of objects like this might have been quite varied depending on the viewer. So yeah, I think it's a little kind of, you know, a fluid, subtle sign that would have alluded to the sacredness associated with the mihrab and to light, clearly, with this really clear image of the lamp.
Yeah, I'm in doubt because there are no colonnettes, which we usually have with the mihrab images. That was that's the reason why I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could be, that would be a very literalist reading of it. For me, it's, you know, a close enough shape, it's similar in its kind of polylobed form, but it is also decorative. I mean, I think it can be both things. For me, it can be both things at once.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question, fellow Ayyubidist.
Yeah, good to see you anyway.
Good to see you too.
Any other questions? Okay, Daniela, please go ahead. But Stephennie, could you please turn off the share screen so we can see everybody?
Yep.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak up first?
Nick.
Can I ask a question to Stephennie?
Yes.
I'm really interested in the relationship between the light conversation going on.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like my question I had about the Roger II coronation mantle. Is there any sense in the way the craft work that is used to make the inscriptions and to all that you're looking at, that they're thinking about how lamplight or how particular kinds of light will play on the you know, play a part in the visual experience? Is that ever taken into account? I mean, I was looking at some of the things seem to be reliefs, and I was wondering if there are lamps above them, then the reliefs would move maybe, or if the light is flickering. I don't know. If there's all of this attention on light, it made me think a lot about what the light looked like and what the light would do to the image itself.
Yeah. That's a really great question. I mean, I think with respect to the, it depends on the context. So like the entrance porta to Al-Hussein, for sure, like it's, you know, sunlight changes over the course of the day as the light moves. That facade faces, I'm trying to remember which direction it faces now. I think it faces west. No, it faces east. So it would catch the morning light, I suppose, and be in shadow in the afternoon. And Muqarnas itself has often been associated, certainly in Fatimid Cairo, for example, people make arguments about, that's where Muqarnas ornament first appears on the exteriors of buildings. And so people make arguments about the ways that Muqarnas as a decorative element dissolves the heavy structural quality of stone and the ways in which it refracts and reflects light. You know, that I think is a pretty solid argument that has been made for Fatimid architecture. I'm really fascinated by the covering of cenotaphs in general. And so those iconographic images on the 3 cenotaphs that I showed they were actually really not meant to be seen, right? And in fact, for me to even get access to them, I could not believe they let me see them, frankly, because I was first told, I had to come back several times. I had to form relationships with the caretakers. It took me a number of tries to actually even get them to lift up the cover of the cenotaph to see them. And so that gives you, I mean, they're behind the grill and then there's a cloth covering them, right? So there's this idea of covering the sacred that of course is also shared across a lot of different ritual traditions. And you know, the kind of allowing me to see it, I think I felt really honored by that. And I'm not sure exactly, you know, how frequently that is done or how much it's part of, I never saw them revealing it to any of the pilgrims who visited or anything like that. So the fact that it's hidden of course, means that it takes out the question of actual light coming in, but I'm reminded of Anne's paper and the way in which hidden things still have, and in many ways often have more power. Certainly within Byzantine art, that's often true. And you know, just the fact that you cannot see them doesn't mean that people don't know that they're there and don't know that, and they're not having a kind of, you know, nevertheless a kind of force. So, yeah, yes, and no, I guess I would say, depending on the context.
Thank you.
Daniela, do you want to ask?
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for a really, really interesting panel. I have a question, or actually two questions for Stephennie and a question for all the other panelists. One for you, Stephennie, is tempting as it is to imagine shared sacred spaces in when people in the Middle East do fight. You know, we also know about animosity between Shias and Sunnis, especially in in Aleppo, is Aleppo under Nuruddin. So how do you actually have, and you know, I've used your idea of a shared sacred space, as you know, but still I'm wondering if we have enough evidence to think that Sunnis and Shias worship together in those places, and whether this you know, what you call a polyvalent iconography was initiated by rulers, by the craftsmen, by the patrons. How do you imagine it? That's one question. Another question is, do we Islamists also have such objects, souvenirs of pilgrims? Perhaps Ampullae that pilgrims brought with them water from Mecca, from the Zamzam in Mecca, or the dust of the. Do you know anything about comparable objects? And I'd love to hear from the other panelists whether this the traffic in relics and souvenirs from the Holy Land, would you assess that it changed the veneration of relics in Europe, or it tied into an existing cult that was there beforehand and continued afterwards, but it enriched it with other, like with more Holy Land relics. But of course there were relics of European saints, right, to venerate and to send from one place to another. So how do you see the larger picture?
I'll just respond quickly, Daniela, to your question. To be clear, I do not argue that there was not any conflict in the medieval Middle East. And on the contrary, I would argue that these acts at conciliation reveal that there were tensions and that these buildings were an effort by Sunni sovereigns to both capitalize on what they knew were large and sometimes restive Shi'i populations who did not appreciate their extension of power, and who were very powerful actors, especially in the case of a large mercantile city like Aleppo. So I don't see them as, you know, some type of like kumbaya idealized space where everybody held hands and prayed together. I see them as really dynamic, active, changing spaces that sometimes were meant to be sites of what I call pragmatic coexistence, right? So it's not that we think we're all going to be best friends. It's just that we have to get along in some way. And here's a thing that we all can agree on, right? So that I would just say in response to the question about regarding the issue of whether Sunnis and Shias prayed together, we do have evidence of that certainly in the present. When I was, you know, working in Syria for over a decade and constantly visiting these sites, you know, people do pray together. They do worship together in these spaces. So there's every indication to imagine, given the fact that all of these buildings were predominantly patronized by Sunni sovereigns, that they were in some way shared among, visitors as well. And the last question about objects that, so somebody, Brandon has a really great example in the Pitt Rivers Museum of leather bags that have the dust swept from inside the Kaaba. I think that practice is still around today, as well as Zamzam water, which you mentioned. Regarding vessels, I don't know of, the only thing that comes to mind are vessels that are sometimes called pilgrim vessels or pilgrim flasks, and those can be in a variety of shapes. But I think that that's kind of a just generalized Orientalist attribution. I'm not sure whether those really have not been well enough studied for us, I think, to know. If somebody has any other, information about vessels to carry sacred, dust or water or something from sites like this, I would really love to hear that. I think Ali has his hand up.
Sorry, I was unmuting my audio. No, I during the presentation as well, with the Ampullae, all I could think about from a contemporary example is Karbala. Karbala, they obviously the dust on the top of the cenotaph is collected, and that's considered sort of pure, what in Farsi they would call khake shifa, or like sort of the dust. Khak means dust, and shifa means the ability to cure. And so it's collected, it's brought, but that's sort of considered the high end thing. But there, you have so many programs going, so they have little dust tablets that people will then take and then either place on the exterior of the cenotaph, the metal grill. And so and those basically have inscriptions on them and stuff like that. So I was just thinking of contemporary examples of what they do. And then so there's other people who will take holy water, which is not holy until they actually put it against the mausoleum itself, and then I'm pretty sure there's vessels that are probably available in the market there. So every time I think about Jerusalem and pilgrim sort of commodities that were available in the Middle Ages, my mind directly goes to what's available in Iraq today, in Najaf and Karbala. So I was bringing that up as a contemporary example to add to the conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe the other panelists want to respond to Daniela's invitation to comment.
Was this the question about what net effect was of the relics coming back on the pre-existing relic culture? Well, I'm sure all of us probably have things to say to that. I can just tell you, because I mapped it very locally in the region that this cross relic came back to Namur. I looked at all of the different relic cults in the area and kind of what happened to them after, how things changed over the course of the 12th century as more relics kept coming back. And the effect was very profound. So, I mean, it seems like the arms race to acquire Holy Land relics began immediately after the First Crusade. And you can watch it ramping up over the course of the 12th century, getting more and more intense, and the claims get more and more dramatic. So that's what I would say, just for that one little area.
I'll just jump in because that phrase "arms race" is literal at points. I don't know if that was deliberate, Nick, or not, but yeah. So one place I worked on, Groningen in the Netherlands, a relic of the arm of St. John, and it has an explosive impact on the local religious culture. It's transformative, and I'm sure Anne has other examples of similar sorts of just a complete reorganization of the regional, local, and transnational topography devotionally.
Yeah, I think, I agree, absolutely. In my experience, I think I find much, maybe it's just the sources I look at sort of from inside the churches rather than from aristocratic culture, but it seems less competitive and more an eagerness and a welcoming of yet hundreds of objects that are pouring in, and they are being integrated into these collections, but not always in a competitive way, in a sort of supplementary way. So for me, it's really been the concept of abundance that's been incredibly crucial, that one can continue to amass a great deal of holy matter. I just gave a paper about the relics of Thomas Becket, which sit alongside all of these Holy Land relics very comfortably, amplifying each other in this way. The shift, maybe longer term shifts that I see, which is how my book ends, have more to do with, for example, how I think Christians in the West come to think about the real significance of all kinds of tiny pieces of matter and material, from dust to oil to things that are additive or manufactured, made in the East and brought back and encapsulate landscapes at work that weren't always, or maybe in bits and pieces, but not, I think, in such abundance, and part of people's sort of religious landscapes, as it were. How those are added in, I think, really changes how Western Christians are called to think about the material nature of things like the Eucharist and relics and sort of bodily matter before them. And I think we can see this, for example, with how the crown of thorns are treated by the Capetians by the second half of the 13th century. The thorns become essentially a kind of media for further, I think, displaying and enhancing, sort of sending out royal connections with the holy and with the crown of thorns. And I think likewise with the feast of Corpus Christi after 1264. That can happen with what people recognize as a wafer, as bread, in part because they've been building to this, I would say, for about a century, right? To think about things as being infused with the holy in this way.
I have many more questions, as I'm sure other people do as well, but I think in the interest of resting before another whole day of conferencing tomorrow, we should probably adjourn. So please join me in thanking both our four panelists and Daniela and Yoni for making this possible. And I'll hopefully see most of you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
מחכה שכולם ילכו, דניאלה.
רציתי להגיד לך שהיה מאוד מאוד מוצלח.
היה מאוד טוב, כן.
היה ממש מעניין.
כן, היה אחלה.
חוסני, אתה עוד איתנו? לא בטוח. כן. We were saying that it was a really interesting session, Stefan and Sarah. I don't know the other. Yeah.
The one before, the one with Sarah and Fna was really good, interesting.
Yeah, great.
So, okay.
Thank you all. See you tomorrow. Bye. Good night.